The air inside our Upper East Side penthouse was suffocatingly thick, with the scent of expensive lilies and the judgmental silence of Manhattan's elite. My name is Maya Collins, and I am 24 years old, but the only person who truly matters in this story is my 30-year-old sister Vivienne, a woman whose calm exterior hides a mind as sharp as a scalpel. Last night, in the middle of our parents' anniversary gala, my stepmother Regina stood at the center of the marble foyer and raised her glass of vintage champagne to command absolute silence. She didn't just look at Vivienne, she glared at her with a predatory satisfaction before announcing to 30 of the city's most powerful people that my sister was officially grounded like a disobedient toddler for daring to stand up to her son Julian. You will remain confined to your quarters until you learn to show Julian the respect he deserves as an heir to this family," Regina declared with a smirk that made my blood run cold. The room erupted into a wave of cruel, snickering laughter, while my father Conrad simply leaned against the grand piano and took a slow, indifferent sip of his scotch. Vivienne didn't scream, or even attempt to defend her shattered dignity. She simply smoothed the silk of her dress and gave a hauntingly calm nod before whispering a single word that seemed to seal her fate. "All right." The next morning, Regina marched to my sister's bedroom door and hammered on the wood with a triumphant grin, shouting through the door to ask if she had finally learned her place. When no answer came, she pushed the door open only to find an eerie, sterile silence and a room that had been stripped completely bare of every piece of clothing and personal trinket. Before she could even process the vacancy, our private family accountant Sloan Whitaker arrived at the penthouse, with his hands trembling and a face as pale as a ghost. He pushed past the maid and held up a stack of legal filings while his voice cracked with pure terror. "Regina, you need to call Conrad right now, because the very floor you are standing on no longer belongs to this family." Before I reveal the staggering master plan Vivienne had been quietly perfecting to ensure my stepmother paid for every single insult, please take a moment to like and subscribe. If this story speaks to you, then drop a comment letting me know your predictions for Regina's fate. Everything started to fracture the morning my grandmother Josephine Collins passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87. Her death felt like the final anchor being lifted from our family ship, leaving Vivienne and me drifting in a sea of my father's increasingly poor decisions. Josephine was the only person who truly understood the weight of our family's history, and she spent her final years teaching Vivienne that art was not about the price tag, but about the soul preserved within the canvas. My father Conrad performed the role of a grieving son for the cameras, yet I noticed how quickly he began inviting Regina into our private spaces before the funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. Regina entered our lives like a gentle ghost, whispering sweet reassurances about how she only wanted to bring light back into our darkened home after such a tragic loss. She started small by rearranging the furniture in the sunroom, but within months, she was systematically replacing my grandmother's heirloom paintings with gaudy, modern pieces that lacked any sense of history. Vivienne was the first to notice the subtle inconsistencies in the household ledgers and the way Regina began making significant financial decisions under Conrad's name without his direct oversight. While I was busy mourning the loss of the only maternal figure I had ever known, Vivienne spent her nights locked in the basement archives of our penthouse. She began the painstaking process of digitizing every trust document and personal ledger that Josephine had secretly left specifically for her. Regina realized very quickly that Vivienne's sharp mind was a threat to her ambition, so she began a calculated campaign to isolate us from Conrad's affection. She would tell long, fabricated stories during dinner about Vivienne's supposed outbursts of disrespect, or my own imaginary rebellions against her new household rules. Conrad was so blinded by Regina's carefully curated charm and her youthful energy that he stopped questioning the validity of her accusations against his own daughters. He started showing a dangerous level of authoritarianism, openly prioritizing Regina's son Julian in every family discussion and business prospect, despite the boy's obvious lack of intellect or work ethic. Julian was 19 and had already been kicked out of 2 prep schools, yet Conrad spoke about him as if he were the brilliant protégé he had always wanted. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I witnessed the moment Regina decided to strip Vivienne of her last remaining sanctuary within the house. Regina walked into the private library where Vivienne was carefully cleaning a 14th-century Ming vase that had been Josephine's favorite piece in the entire collection. Regina leaned against the mahogany doorway with a smirk that didn't match the faux concern in her voice as she asked Vivienne why she was still clinging to the dusty relics of a woman who was long gone. "Why waste your youth on these fossils, Vivienne? This room needs a modern touch, something that actually reflects the current status of the Collins name," Regina remarked, while tracing the edge of the display pedestal with a manicured finger. Vivienne didn't even look up from her work, simply stating that some things in this world were worth preserving because they held a value that money could never truly buy. Regina's face twisted in a flash of genuine rage before she intentionally bumped into the pedestal, sending the priceless vase shattering across the marble floor in 1,000 jagged pieces. Before the dust had even settled, Regina began screaming for Conrad, claiming that Vivienne had thrown the vase at her in a fit of uncontrollable jealousy over Julian's recent internship. Conrad burst into the room and didn't even bother to look at the tears in Vivienne's eyes or the trembling of her hands as she looked at the ruins of her grandmother's legacy. He pointed a shaking finger at the door and told Vivienne that her access to the library and the art archives was officially revoked until she learned to control her temper. "Your grandmother would be ashamed of this petty destruction, and I will not have you threatening the peace of this household anymore," Conrad barked while pulling Regina close to his side. Regina tucked herself under Conrad's arm, feigning a sob, while she whispered that perhaps Vivienne was becoming mentally unstable just like her mother had been before she left. Vivienne stood there in the middle of the wreckage looking at our father with a cold clarity that I had never seen before in my entire life. She realized in that moment that our father was no longer a protector, but a man who had traded his integrity for the shallow comfort of a woman who was slowly draining his soul. Vivienne leaned down to pick up a single blue shard of the broken vase, tucking it into her pocket as she walked past them without saying a word of defense. I followed her into our shared bedroom and found her opening a hidden compartment in her mahogany desk where she kept Josephine's original unedited will. She looked at me and said that if they wanted to treat our home like a battlefield, then she was more than ready to show them how much she had learned from the woman who built this empire. 3 months before that disastrous anniversary party at the penthouse, the atmosphere in our home had already shifted from uncomfortable to outright predatory. I remember walking past Dad's private study when the heavy mahogany doors creaked open, revealing Vivienne standing stiffly in front of his massive oak desk. Conrad was leaning back in his leather chair, tapping a gold fountain pen against a stack of legal documents, with an impatience that made the air feel thin. He didn't look like a grieving son or a loving father anymore, but rather like a cold businessman who was losing his grip on his own empire. Vivienne looked down at the papers he had shoved toward her, her eyes scanning the lines with the precision of a master restorer who could spot a forgery from across a room. Dad cleared his throat and told her that he needed her professional signature on a specific set of appraisals for the private art collection Julian had supposedly inherited. It wasn't just a request for a signature, it was a demand for Vivienne to lend her hard-earned reputation to a blatant lie designed to evade millions in corporate taxes. "You want me to certify these as authentic when we both know Julian bought them at a flea market in Jersey last summer?" Vivienne asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. Dad's face flushed a deep, angry crimson before he slammed his hand down, making the crystal inkwell rattle against the wood. He shouted that her entire career was built on the back of his bank account, and that her value to this family was currently limited to what her hands could do for Julian's future. Sign the damn papers, Vivienne, because your integrity doesn't pay the mortgage on this penthouse, and it certainly won't pay for Maya's next semester. Conrad barked with a venomous glare. It was the most heartbreaking betrayal I had ever witnessed, seeing a father tell his eldest daughter that her soul was nothing more than a bargaining chip for a stepson's unearned fortune. Vivienne didn't flinch or raise her voice, but instead, she calmly stated that she would never sign her name to a fraudulent document, regardless of who was holding the pen. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, Regina stepped out from the shadows of the library corner draped in a silk robe that cost more than my entire year of college. She walked over to Conrad and placed a manicured hand on his shoulder, looking at Vivienne with a sneer that revealed exactly how much she despised my sister's moral backbone. Regina laughed softly and remarked that Vivienne was acting rather high and mighty for someone who was essentially just a glorified domestic worker with a fancy title. You should be grateful your father is giving you a chance to be useful, Vivienne, because without the Collins name, you are just a girl playing with old brushes in a basement. Regina said with a poisonous sweetness. Vivienne simply picked up her leather portfolio and turned toward the door, telling them both that a name could be lost in a day, but a reputation for honesty was something they could Baogio afford to buy back. I found Vivienne later that evening in the back of a quiet cafe near Central Park, sitting across from my sister's best friend, Sterling. Sterling was a sharp-eyed corporate strategist who had known Vivienne since their university days, and he was the only person she truly trusted with the details of our family's internal collapse. Sterling leaned over the table and handed her a small encrypted flash drive, whispering that the legal contacts our grandmother Josephine had used were already standing by to review the digitized files. The digital vaults are vulnerable, as long as Conrad has the master override, so you need to cut his access before he realizes you've moved the server. Sterling warned while checking his watch nervously. Vivienne thanked him for the support, explaining that she had already begun the process of locking down the restoration archives and rerouting the codes to a private cloud he had helped her set up. There was no crying or desperation in her eyes that night, only a cold, calculated focus that honestly frightened me more than our father's explosive temper. Vivienne told Sterling that she was no longer interested in saving the family business. She was only interested in ensuring that the woman who was trying to burn our lives down ended up with nothing but ashes. They spent hours going over the intricate details of the trust laws, looking for the specific loopholes that Josephine had warned Vivienne about in those final letters. I realized then that Vivienne wasn't just planning a quiet exit. She was building a cage for the predators who thought they had her cornered. As we walked back toward the penthouse, Vivienne pulled out her phone and quietly deleted the remote access app that allowed Dad to monitor her work progress. She looked at me and said that from this moment on, the only person who would have power over her future was herself, and she was done playing the role of the obedient daughter for a man who didn't exist anymore. 14 days before the anniversary gala, a strange and unsettling silence fell over our penthouse as Vivienne suddenly transformed into a person I barely recognized. She stopped arguing with Conrad about the fraudulent appraisals and began accepting even the most demeaning household chores that Regina threw her way with an eerie, hollow smile. I watched my sister scrub the marble floors of the foyer and polish Regina's endless collection of designer shoes, as if she had finally been broken by the weight of our father's disappointment. Regina clearly took this sudden submission as a total victory, strutting through the hallways with a renewed sense of arrogance, while she treated my sister like a common servant. Make sure you get the scuffs off the heels of those Manolos, Vivienne, because I need them to look perfect for the charity auction tonight, Regina remarked with a condescending pat on my sister's shoulder. Vivienne didn't complain once. Even Key Julian intentionally tracked mud across a freshly cleaned rug or spilled his morning coffee just to watch her clean it up on her hands and knees. It was agonizing to witness her dignity being stripped away piece by piece, yet there was a cold, shimmering light in her eyes that told me this was all part of a much larger and more dangerous game. The situation reached a boiling point during a private dress fitting key. Regina decided to escalate her psychological warfare into something far more criminal and permanent. While Vivienne was busy steaming the heavy silk drapes in the master bedroom, Regina slipped into the dressing area where my sister had left her personal leather tote bag unattended. I happened to be standing just outside the partially closed door, my heart hammering against my ribs, as I saw Regina pull a diamond tennis necklace from her velvet jewelry box. She looked around with a frantic, guilty intensity before dropping the shimmering piece deep into the inner pocket of Vivienne's bag and covering it with a silk scarf. Regina then walked calmly back into the living room, screaming that her favorite $1 million heirloom had been stolen from the vanity while her back was turned for just a few minutes. Vivienne walked out of the bedroom with a calm expression, but I noticed she had left her phone sitting on the coffee table with the voice memo app quietly running in the background. Julian seized the opportunity to make a scene in front of the gathered domestic staff, laughing as he called my sister a pathetic thief who inherited our mother's low-class instincts for deception. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? Vivienne, considering your mother was nothing but a runaway waitress with a talent for taking things that didn't belong to her." Julian sneered while leaning against the doorframe. Vivienne stood perfectly still under the barrage of his insults, her face a mask of porcelain indifference, while Julian continued to mock our biological mother's memory with increasingly vile slurs. Conrad walked into the room just as Regina began feigning a hysterical breakdown, sobbing into his chest about how she no longer felt safe in her own home with a criminal living under the same roof. "I've had enough of your toxic resentment poisoning this family, so I am signing these papers to officially revoke your inheritance and exclude you from the trust, forever," Conrad barked while slamming his briefcase shut. Despite the crushing weight of that announcement, Vivienne simply nodded and returned to her room to finish the final stages of her own clandestine operation. She spent the next several hours on her encrypted laptop finalizing the digital transfer of every authentic artifact that our grandmother Josephine had hidden from Conrad's sight. While the family was busy celebrating my sister's downfall in the dining room, she was coordinating with a high-security transport team to move the real treasures to a private vault under the name of the new trust. She replaced the most valuable sculptures and paintings with the identical replicas she had meticulously crafted over the previous months, ensuring that the visual landscape of the penthouse remained unchanged to an untrained eye. Every time Regina walked past a painting and admired its beauty, she was actually looking at a worthless canvas that Vivienne had painted while she was supposedly being grounded in her room. Vivienne looked at me that night and whispered that the most effective way to trap a predator was to let them believe they had already won the prize before the cage door even began to swing shut. The last notes of the celebratory music had barely faded into the humid New York night when the penthouse became a stage for a very different kind of performance. Regina was still lingering in the grand dining room, nursing a final glass of wine, while she basked in the delusional glow of her absolute victory over our family's future. She looked like a queen who had finally vanquished her greatest rival, unaware that the kingdom she thought she possessed was already beginning to dissolve into thin air. I moved silently through the shadows of the secondary hallway, meeting my sister near the climate-controlled storage unit, where our grandmother's most precious legacies were kept. The air was still thick with the smell of expensive champagne and the lingering arrogance of people who believed that money could buy total submission. Vivienne didn't say a word as she handed me a pair of industrial-grade suction cups and pointed toward the massive landscape painting that had anchored the living room for over 40 years. "The frames stay on the wall so they don't notice the weight difference until it is far too late to stop the transport," Vivienne whispered while she carefully sliced through the backing of a multi-million-dollar canvas. With the practiced efficiency of a professional restorer, my sister began to do the genuine masterpieces and replacing them with the flawless fakes she had created during her months of supposed grounding. We worked in a rhythmic, terrifying silence, swapping out centuries of history for worthless canvases that only mimicked the appearance of value. I felt a strange mixture of adrenaline and profound grief as I watched her handle our grandmother's favorite sculptures with a tenderness that no one else in this house ever possessed. Every time a board creaked or a distant siren wailed on the street below, my heart stopped. But Vivienne remained as calm as a surgeon performing a life-saving operation. By 3 in the morning, the penthouse looked exactly the same as it had during the gala. Yet it was now nothing more than a hollow shell filled with artistic lies and empty promises. Before we reached the front door, Vivienne walked into Regina's dimly lit dressing room and stood before the ornate vanity where the diamond necklace incident had occurred. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her company smartphone, along with every corporate credit card that Dad had ever issued in her name. My sister placed them precisely in the center of Regina's vanity mirror, a silent but deafening symbol of her total financial severance from the Collins empire. They think they can ground me by taking away my freedom, so I will ground them by taking away their reality, Vivienne muttered as she checked her watch one last time. We stepped out of the penthouse at precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, the heavy steel doors clicking shut with a finality that felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I looked at Vivienne as we waited for the elevator, noticing how she didn't look back at the place we had called home for over 2 decades. The morning sun began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse around 7, bringing with it a sense of false security that Regina was eager to exploit. She rose from her bed with a triumphant smirk, wrapping herself in a designer robe as she marched toward my sister's bedroom to deliver one final round of verbal abuse. Regina hammered on the door with her manicured fists, shouting through the wood, "Wake up, Vivienne, because the cleaning staff is coming, and I expect you to show them exactly where you missed a spot yesterday." When the door swung open under the pressure of her hand, she didn't find a broken woman begging for forgiveness or a sister crying over her lost inheritance. The room was chillingly empty, stripped of every personal trace, leaving behind nothing but a cold breeze coming from the slightly ajar window. The silence of the room began to feel like a suffocating shroud as Regina slowly realized that she was no longer in control of the narrative. She spun around and sprinted toward the living room, her eyes darting toward the paintings and sculptures that appeared perfectly normal at first glance. It wasn't until she reached out to touch the surface of the landscape painting and felt the tacky, fresh oil of a replica that the panic truly began to set in. "Conrad, get out here right now because your daughter has stolen everything that wasn't bolted to the floor." Regina shrieked, her voice cracking with a raw terror that echoed through the vacant hallways. She let out a guttural, strangled scream as she realized that the soul of the mansion had vanished along with the 2 sisters she had so carelessly insulted. Everything she had fought to steal was now revealed to be a collection of worthless illusions, and for the first time in her life, Regina felt the cold, sharp edge of a trap that she had walked into with her eyes wide open. The clock in the grand foyer struck 8 times, echoing through the hollow halls of the penthouse like a funeral knell for our father's vanishing authority. Conrad stood in the center of the living room, his face a terrifying shade of purple, as he screamed into his phone for the security team to find his daughters immediately. Regina paced behind him, her expensive silk heels clicking frantically against the marble floor, while she adjusted her jewelry with trembling fingers. Their world was spinning out of control, yet the true storm hadn't even reached the shore until the elevator doors opened to reveal Sloane Whitaker. Sloane didn't look like the timid accountant who usually handled the family tax returns, but rather like a messenger of cold, hard reality carrying a heavy leather briefcase. He walked straight past the panicked domestic staff and placed a thick folder onto the coffee table with a thud that seemed to silence the entire room. Dad turned his fury toward him, demanding to know why Vivienne hadn't been located and why the household accounts were suddenly showing a zero balance. "You have exactly 5 seconds to tell me where my daughter is hiding before I have you blacklisted from every firm in this city." Conrad barked, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. Sloane adjusted his glasses and looked at our father with a mixture of pity and professional detachment before opening the first document in the stack. The reason you cannot find your daughters, Conrad, is because they have officially vacated a property that you no longer have the legal right to occupy. Sloane stated with a voice as steady as a mountain. He began to explain the intricate legal structure of the Josephine Collins Art Preservation Trust, a document that had been quietly amended years before our grandmother passed away. According to the original title deeds, this penthouse and 70% of the family's private art collection were never part of Conrad's personal estate at all. They were held in a protected trust that transferred full ownership and control to Vivienne the moment she turned 25, a milestone she had reached just last week. That is impossible because I am the sole heir to my mother's fortune, and no child of mine is going to steal what I built, Conrad shouted while grabbing the papers with shaking hands. Regina let out a shrill, hysterical laugh, claiming that the documents had to be forged because she was the mistress of this house and would never allow such a betrayal. Sloane didn't even blink as he pulled out a second folder containing a detailed audit of the business transactions Conrad had authorized for Julian's failed ventures. He calmly explained that our father had committed a massive breach of fiduciary duty by using trust assets to cover Julian's gambling debts and fraudulent art deals. Vivienne has spent the last 3 months documenting every single dollar you funneled out of her grandmother's legacy to satisfy Regina's greed, Sloane remarked, while sliding a tablet across the table. He pressed a button on the screen and suddenly the room was filled with the high-definition footage of Regina slipping the diamond necklace into Vivienne's bag. Regina's face turned as pale as a ghost as she watched her own calculated crime play out in front of the man she had spent years manipulating. I did it for us, Conrad, because that girl was going to destroy everything we worked for with her constant interference. Regina shrieked, her voice cracking with a raw terror that echoed through the vacant hallways. Sloane informed them that Vivienne had already filed a comprehensive report with the authorities regarding tax evasion and insurance fraud related to the fake appraisals Dad had signed. Every joint account, every corporate credit card, and every offshore fund linked to the Collins name had been frozen by the court to facilitate a full forensic investigation. You mean to tell me that I am broke, Sloane, that I don't even have enough to pay the staff for the rest of the week? Conrad whispered, the image of the powerful patriarch crumbling before our eyes. The penthouse that had once been a symbol of his absolute power was now a prison of his own making, filled with worthless replicas and the echoes of his many betrayals. The most disgusting part of the entire morning was watching how quickly Regina's mask of devotion slipped once she realized the money was truly gone. Instead of comforting our father, she began to scream at him for being a weak, incompetent manager who allowed a 25-year-old girl to outsmart him in his own home. She called him a pathetic old man and blamed his lack of oversight for the fact that Julian's future was now effectively ruined before it had even begun. Conrad looked at his wife as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time, finally realizing that the woman he chose over his own daughters was a predator who only loved the scent of his bank account. 24 hours after the financial explosion that shattered the Collins empire, the air inside the mahogany-lined conference room of Sloane's law firm felt thick with a heavy, inescapable tension. Vivienne sat at the head of the massive glass table, her posture radiating the quiet authority of someone who had already won the war before the first shot was even fired. Conrad sat across from her with his shoulders slumped and his expensive tailored suit looking suddenly too large for his diminished frame. Regina was huddled next to him, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for a weakness in the legal armor surrounding my sister. Vivienne, please, you have to listen to reason and think about what this scandal will do to the family name on Wall Street. Conrad pleaded with a voice that was barely a whisper. My sister didn't even blink as she leaned forward. Her face a mask of cold granite that showed absolutely no sign of the daughter who used to seek his approval. The family name died the second you let a predator into our home to scavenge through grandmother's soul for spare change. Vivienne replied, her voice cutting through the room like a surgical blade. Conrad's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water, realizing that his usual tactics of intimidation and guilt were completely useless against the woman standing before him. Regina tried to intervene with a forced, tearful sob, claiming she only acted out of love for her husband and his future prosperity. "Spare me the performance, Regina, because I have the bank statements showing you were actually loving Julian's gambling habit with Maya's tuition money," Vivienne stated while sliding a stack of red-stamped documents across the glass surface. The room fell into a deafening silence as Conrad scanned the dates and amounts, realizing that his loyal wife had been gutting his accounts from the inside for over 3 years. "Is this true, Regina? Did you really take the education funds I promised to my own children to pay off your son's debts in Atlantic City?" Conrad asked, his voice filled with a profound and bitter regret. Regina tried to stammer out an excuse about protecting Julian's reputation, but Vivienne cut her off before she could utter a single word of her practiced lies. "You didn't just steal money, you stole time and peace from a family that gave you everything while you gave us nothing but venom," my sister remarked with a chilling calmness. Julian suddenly stood up and slammed his fist on the table, shouting that Vivienne was just a bitter girl who couldn't handle the fact that our father finally had a real son to carry on his legacy. A legacy of fraud and failure is not something anyone should be proud of, Julian. So I suggest you sit down before the police decide to move your scheduled interview to this afternoon. Sloane intervened with a sharp professional edge. The senior partner of the firm handed Conrad a formal restraining order and a notice of immediate eviction that felt like a final death warrant for his social standing. Vivienne informed them that they had exactly 12 hours to remove their personal belongings from the penthouse before the locks were changed and the security codes were deactivated forever. "You will leave with nothing but the clothes on your backs and whatever personal items the court deems are not part of the Josephine Collins Trust," Vivienne stated while standing up to end the meeting. Julian began to scream about his rights as a legal resident, but Sloane calmly reminded him that the evidence of insurance fraud they had gathered would be more than enough to ensure he spent his next few years in a much smaller room than the penthouse. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that I could almost feel the weight of the years of humiliation being lifted off my sister's shoulders in a single, glorious moment of justice. Maya watched as Vivienne walked toward the door without looking back, leaving our father to deal with the wreckage of the life he had so carelessly built on a foundation of lies. "Don't bother calling the office, Dad, because the board of directors has already been notified of the criminal investigation and your access has been terminated," my sister said over her shoulder before the heavy doors swung shut. We walked out of the law firm and into the bright New York afternoon, the city noise feeling like a symphony of freedom after the suffocating silence of our previous lives. My sister looked at me and smiled for the first time in months, a genuine expression of peace that had been absent since the day our grandmother passed away. As the elevator doors closed on the past, I realized that Vivienne hadn't just saved our inheritance. She had reclaimed our souls from the people who thought we were nothing more than obstacles in their path. 6 months had passed since the dust finally settled on the legal wreckage of the Collins Empire, and the morning air felt cleaner than it had in decades. I stood in the center of our new non-profit art gallery, watching the sun illuminate the authentic masterpieces that Vivienne had fought so hard to protect from our father's greed. We had transformed an old industrial warehouse in Brooklyn into a sanctuary for genuine beauty, fulfilling our grandmother Josephine's final wish to keep these treasures accessible to the public. My sister walked over to me with a stack of mail in her hand, her face glowing with a quiet peace that no amount of inheritance money could ever buy. "Maya, did you see the headlines about the latest auction fraud investigation involving Regina's former associates in New Jersey?" Vivienne asked while handing me a freshly printed exhibition catalog. She had spent the morning coordinating a restoration workshop for underprivileged students, proving that her talent was a gift to be shared rather than a tool for corporate tax evasion. I heard she is struggling just to keep the lights on in that tiny apartment, which is a poetic kind of justice for someone who worshipped luxury. I replied while placing a sculpture in its new display case. My sister smiled and pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket, the familiar and shaky handwriting of our father instantly catching my attention. Conrad was now living a life of forced solitude, spending his days answering endless summons from the tax authorities and struggling to pay off the massive back taxes Regina had accumulated. He was hanging guy, facing the cold reality of a world that no longer cared about his name, now that his bank accounts were empty. He sent another letter begging for a meeting, claiming he has finally realized the true value of family over the noise of the business world. Vivienne remarked with a sigh of weary indifference. She didn't even bother to break the seal on the letter instead, walking over to the small decorative fireplace in the lounge and dropping the envelope into the flickering flames. The fire is the only place where his lies can finally be put to rest without hurting anyone else ever again, my sister muttered as the paper turned into gray ash. The consequences for our antagonists had been swift and absolute, leaving Regina to face the very poverty she had spent her entire life trying to escape through manipulation. She had been stripped of every designer gown and diamond accessory she had ever stolen from our family, forced to move back to a dilapidated suburb where no one knew her name. Julian had fared even worse, as his involvement in the insurance fraud schemes had led to a permanent ban from the art world and a looming legal battle that he had no resources to win. They were all living in a prison of their own making, surrounded by the bitterness of their failed schemes, while Vivienne and I were finally building a life rooted in honesty. The most important lesson I learned through this entire ordeal is that the true value of a person is never found in the assets they manage to seize through deception. It lies instead in the strength of their character and their ability to remain independent and resilient when the world tries to strip them of their dignity. Vivienne proved that the silence of an intelligent person is never a sign of weakness, but rather a period of careful preparation for a righteous and powerful counterattack. You should never trade your soul or your family for fleeting superficial values, because when the spotlight fades, you will find yourself standing in a room full of nothing but cold shadows. A person who builds their kingdom on the suffering of others will eventually find that their crown is nothing more than a heavy burden of regret and empty promises. I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for listening to the story of Vivienne and Maya's powerful rise against all odds until the very end. Your incredible support has been the driving force that encourages me to continue sharing these real-life lessons about justice and integrity in the modern family. The journey from being treated as obedient shadows to becoming the masters of our own destiny has been difficult, but it was worth every sacrifice. Please leave a comment below to share your personal thoughts on Vivienne's brilliant and calculated path to justice, as I would love to hear your perspective on our victory. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming dramatic scripts and the deep life lessons that come with them. Our story is proof that as long as you have the courage to stand your ground, the truth will always find a way to light the path forward.